October 1854. A wind sweeps across the Crimean plain, cold, thin, and metallic. It tastes of smoke and salt from the Black Sea. Beneath a pale morning sky, the valley before Balaclava lies silent for a heartbeat, like a stage awaiting its final act. 600 men of the Light Brigade sit astride their horses, sabers drawn, eyes fixed ahead. The ground trembles beneath them, not from their own readiness, but from the thunder of Russian guns that line the valley on three sides. And somewhere, among the ranks, a young cavalryman whispers a prayer he does not remember learning. The order has already been given. None of them truly understand it, not fully. It has passed from lord to aide, from aide to officer, distorted with each telling. Yet the army moves with obedience, as if bound by an invisible code older than any general's mistake. The bugle sounds. The lines tighten. Then, with the grace of a single heartbeat shared among hundreds, the Light Brigade begins to move. First at a trot, then at a gallop, then at a fury that defies all sense. The valley erupts. Russian artillery opens fire, each cannonball screaming through the air like an iron comet. The earth splits and churns beneath the hooves. Shards of rock and flesh fall together in a storm of dirt and flame. Horses rear, riders are thrown, but the formation holds. They do not slow. They cannot. For the men of the Light Brigade, lords and laborers, poets and paupers, are bound by one terrible truth. Their courage will not be measured by victory, but by endurance. Smoke thickens. Through it, the shapes of men become ghosts, fragments of a doomed advance. To the left and right, comrades vanish into red mist. Still, they press on. The Russians, stunned by the madness before them, load and fire again. It is not war now, but ritual, one side enacting duty, the other disbelief. And at the center of it all, the young cavalryman rides on, his world reduced to sound and motion, the pounding of hooves, the hiss of shrapnel, the cry of a dying horse beside him. No one speaks of fear. There is no time, yet it rides with them, silent and suffocating, coiled in every heartbeat. They know they cannot survive this charge, but to falter is to dishonor every man beside them. In that terrible symmetry of bravery and futility, Britain's finest light cavalry rides straight into the heart of fire. When they reach the Russian guns, it is chaos incarnate. The cavalry crashes through the battery, sabers flashing like mirrors of the rising sun. Gunners are cut down, cannon overturned, horses stumble and scream. The young cavalryman fights with a kind of clarity only death allows, until his horse falls beneath him, torn apart by a shell. The world turns over, sky to earth, and he lies among the ruins of courage. The charge lasts barely 20 minutes. Yet in those minutes, something irreversible happens. Not to the battle, but to the British soul. The survivors, bloodied and shattered, ride back through the valley, past the rows of the dead. Lord Cardigan, imperious and unmoved, counts the living. Of 600, fewer than 200 remain unscathed. The rest lie silent beneath the smoke, their bravery spent for a blunder no man can yet explain. That evening, the sky burned red with the reflection of Sevastopol's guns. Across the camps, the wounded whisper the same words. We obeyed. For obedience was all they had left when reason failed. And in that obedience, blind, steadfast, and ruinous, lay both the greatness and the tragedy of the Victorian age. Far from the battlefield, Britain will soon hear of what happened in this valley. The courage, the slaughter, the mistake. It will reach London through the pen of a war correspondent, whose dispatches will turn military disaster into national legend. In drawing rooms and taverns, the phrase, "The charge of the Light Brigade," will become a hymn to sacrifice and endurance, masking the truth of miscommunication and pride that sent them to die. But here, on this scorched plain, there are no hymns. Only the flicker of dying fires and the whisper of the steppe wind moving through the dead. The young cavalryman lies among them, his hand still gripping his sword, his face turned toward the dawn. Around him, the Empire's dream of invincibility lies broken, not by defeat, but by the realization that courage alone cannot save men from folly. And yet, in the strange silence that follows, a seed is sown, of reflection, of doubt, of reckoning. For if this is what loyalty demands, then what truly is the price of glory? The valley will be remembered as sacred ground, not for victory, but for the question it left behind. A question that will haunt generals, politicians, and poets alike. A question that will echo through the heart of Britain itself. The smoke of Balaclava still hangs in the imagination. But to understand why 600 rode into the Valley of Fire, we must look not to the battlefield, but to the heart of the empire itself. Britain, in the middle of the 19th century, stands radiant and restless. The factories of Manchester thunder with invention. The docks of London pour wealth from every ocean. The red of the map seems endless. And yet, behind the triumph lies unease, an empire aware of its own fragility, staring eastward at a rival whose shadow grows longer each year. Russia, vast and hungry, stretches its reach toward the decaying Ottoman Empire, the so-called sick man of Europe. To British eyes, this is not merely a question of geography, but of destiny. The Tsar's armies threaten Constantinople, the narrow straits that guard the route to India, the lifeline of British power. If Russia claims the East, the very architecture of global dominance could crumble. And so, beneath the polished calm of Queen Victoria's reign, a deep anxiety stirs, that Britain, master of the seas, might soon be cornered on land. In Westminster, the mood turns febrile. The Foreign Office warns of a continental crisis. The Times thunders about Russian tyranny and Britain's sacred duty to defend civilization. In parlors and pubs alike, patriotism flares like wildfire. Men speak of defending liberty, though few could point to Crimea on a map. War, in the public imagination, is a distant theater of valor, a stage for the empire's moral superiority. Yet for ministers and generals, it is a problem of logistics, pride, and perception. To do nothing is to appear weak. To act is to step into a conflict that no one truly understands. Thus, in the spring of that year, Britain made its fateful decision. An expeditionary force, 5 divisions of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, is assembled to join France and the Ottoman Turks against Russia. The order reads like a proclamation of confidence, but beneath it lies confusion. The army that will sail to the Crimea is the same institution that last fought a major European power 40 years earlier, in the time of Napoleon. Its weapons are outdated, its organization archaic, its officers chosen more by lineage than competence. Britain, though industrially modern, is sending an army rooted in another age. The men themselves are a reflection of the empire's paradox. Volunteers, career soldiers, and drifters fill the ranks, veterans of colonial skirmishes who have never faced a modern European army. They march in scarlet coats and polished brass, proud but ill-supplied, their commanders divided by ego and habit. Lord Raglan, the army's aging commander, once served under Wellington and still measures war by Napoleonic standards. His subordinates, Cardigan, Lucan, Airy, feud like rival aristocrats at a hunting meet. None foresee the scale of what awaits them. When the fleet sails from Portsmouth, crowds line the quays, cheering as the regimental bands play Rule, Britannia. The ships are heavy with optimism, but light with preparation. Maps are vague, supply chains uncertain, medical care non-existent. The officers dine on silver, the soldiers on hope. It is not strategy that propels them eastward, but faith in empire, in God, and in the unspoken belief that British courage can overcome any failing of leadership. Weeks later, the Armada anchored in the Black Sea. The Crimea rises on the horizon, barren, windswept, and utterly foreign. The soldiers, sweating in their wool uniforms, look upon the shore with awe and doubt. Here, in this remote corner of the world, they are to decide the balance of Europe. They do not yet know that cholera will kill more than cannon fire, that frostbite will cripple more than Russian shot, or that their letters home will ignite a public fury no government can contain. Back in London, the war is a spectacle. Newspapers carry heroic sketches of battles not yet fought. Sermons praise the righteousness of Britain's cause. The empire hungers for meaning, and the Crimea seems to offer it, a chance to prove that power and virtue are one. Yet, behind every printed victory lies the unspoken truth. Britain has entered a war of arrogance and miscalculation. The expedition is not born of necessity, but of fear, the fear of decline, the fear of being forgotten, the fear that the empire's glory might be built on sand. As autumn approaches, the British and French armies march inland towards Sevastopol, the great Russian fortress on the coast. The campaign begins with triumph, the victory at Alma, but already the cracks show. Supplies vanish, orders contradict, men fall ill by the hundreds. Still, the march continues, driven not by strategy, but by momentum. The empire, once so certain of its purpose, now moves forward, because it cannot imagine retreat, and somewhere beyond the horizon, Across the hills and valleys of that desolate peninsula, the storm of Balaclava waits. It will not be the first mistake of this war, but it will be the one history never forgets. The armada that had sailed from England in glory now anchors off the desolate Crimean coast, its decks scarred by salt and sickness. As the soldiers disembark onto the barren plains, they step into a world that feels both ancient and forsaken. Treeless ridges, dust-choked valleys, and an air heavy with foreboding. The British Army, proud heir to Waterloo's legend, arrives with fanfare but without foresight. They have brought too much ceremony and too little sense. Silver cutlery gleams in officers' trunks, while the men go without tents or proper boots. The Empire's finest expeditionary force is, from the moment it lands, already at war with itself. On the beaches of Eupatoria, confusion reigns. Crates of ammunition lie unopened, while barrels of wine are stacked in perfect order. Horses die before touching the battlefield, felled by thirst and exhaustion. Yet amidst the disorder, the army's confidence remains unshaken. They have come to face what they believe is an inferior foe, and victory, they assume, is merely a matter of time. Lord Raglan, courteous and indecisive, commands from his tent like a man still dreaming of Wellington's era. Beneath him, Lord Lucan and Lord Cardigan glare at each other with cold contempt, their personal feud older than the war itself. Orders pass between them like barbs, and every instruction carries the sting of pride. Then comes the first battle, the River Alma. Under the burning September sun, the Allied British and French forces storm Russian positions with reckless courage. The British infantry, disciplined and resolute, climbs the steep heights under fire, bayonets flashing, their red coats bright against the smoke. It is a brutal and clumsy victory, but a victory nonetheless. The Russians retreat, and cheers echo across the camp that night. Newspapers in London will soon call it proof of Britain's invincibility. Yet, the men who fought know better. The dead lie in heaps, the wounded scream for hours, and the doctors have no instruments but knives and rum. The illusion of triumph has already begun to rot from within. From Alma, the army marches south towards Sevastopol, the great Russian fortress on the Black Sea. It is to be a short campaign, or so the generals believe. But the roads dissolve into mud, the carts collapse, and the autumn storms begin. Rain turns to frost, frost to ice. The soldiers, unprepared for the Crimean winter, shiver in their torn uniforms. Disease spreads like wildfire, cholera, dysentery, typhus. In every regiment, men vanish not from bullets, but from hunger and neglect. Still, the command presses on, bound by stubbornness and pride. They are the Empire's sons, they tell themselves. They cannot fail. In Sevastopol, the Russians dig in. The siege begins, and with it, the slow unraveling of discipline. Cannon fire roars day and night, a thunder that shakes the sea itself. The British build their camps on exposed hills, within range of enemy guns, because no one dares contradict Raglan's positioning. When supplies finally arrive from the coast, they are lost in bureaucratic labyrinths. Bread goes moldy in warehouses, while soldiers chew on horseflesh. The French, better organized and more pragmatic, begin to view their allies with a mix of pity and disdain. Yet, for all its blunders, the British army clings to a strange, fatal confidence. The conviction that courage alone can compensate for chaos. In the officers' mess, glasses are raised to the Empire's glory. In the ranks, men trade sardonic jokes about dying before the paperwork catches up. Amid this grim camaraderie, one truth becomes clear. The war has ceased to be about strategy. It is now a contest of endurance, between arrogance and adaptation, between those who learn and those who refuse to. By October, the focus shifted to the small port of Balaclava, a vital lifeline for the British supply lines. The Russians, emboldened by the stalemate, prepare a massive assault on the Allied flank. The British position is precarious, thinly held by Turkish auxiliaries and a handful of cavalry brigades. Raglan, cautious and far from the front, tries to coordinate defenses through messengers and aides. What follows will be a symphony of miscommunication. Orders written in haste, carried on horseback across miles of smoke and confusion, will soon decide the fate of hundreds. In the hills above the valley, Lord Lucan receives a message so vague it could mean anything. He is to advance and prevent the enemy from carrying away captured guns. To Lucan, it sounds like an order for full attack. To Raglan, it was meant as a limited maneuver. Between them stands one man, Captain Lewis Nolan, a brilliant, impetuous officer whose temper and pride will ignite the disaster. He delivers Raglan's order with scorn, gesturing towards the Russian lines, his words sharp as sabers. Within minutes, the decision is made. The Light Brigade will charge, not against a retreating enemy, but straight into a valley lined with Russian artillery. In that moment, history tightens its grip. Pride has become blindness. Obedience, a death sentence. None yet know it, but the Empire's myth of honor is about to meet its reckoning in the smoke of Balaclava. The path from arrogance to tragedy has been paved, and at its end waits the Valley of Death. The morning of Balaclava begins with the sound of distant cannon fire. A low, rhythmic pounding that rolls through the hills like thunder trapped beneath the earth. In the British camp, officers mount their horses in uneasy silence. Smoke drifts across the plain, veiling the ridges in a pale grey mist. Somewhere to the north, Lord Raglan stands on a rise, spyglass in hand, watching the Russian columns advance. From his vantage point, he can see the enemy seizing captured guns on the far side of the valley. He dictates an order, hurried, imprecise, carried by a single messenger, whose pride will burn brighter than his caution. Captain Louis Nolan rides with the order clenched in his gloved hand. He is brave, brilliant, and dangerously sure of himself, a man who believes he alone understands the art of war. When he reaches Lord Lucan, the commander of the cavalry, the air is already thick with tension. Lucan and his brother-in-law, Lord Cardigan, command the heavy and light brigades, and despise each other with a venom only aristocratic vanity can sustain. Raglan's words are simple. Advance rapidly to the front. Prevent the enemy from carrying away the guns. But from where Lucan stands, the meaning is unclear. Which guns? Where? The valley ahead bristles with Russian artillery, lined across three sides like the jaws of a trap. Nolan, impatient and contemptuous, gestures towards the far battery. His voice cuts like steel. There, my lord, your objective. Lucan hesitates, knowing it is madness. Cardigan, proud and cold, waits for orders. Raglan's meaning, Nolan's tone, Lucan's pride all collide in that instant. The decision is made. The Light Brigade will charge the valley. As the men form up, a strange quiet falls. 600 cavalry, lancers, hussars, and dragoons align their ranks with the precision of parade ground drill. The sunlight flashes off polished sabers and brass helmets. The horses snort and stamp, sensing the tension of their riders. Among them, young troopers adjust their reins and whisper fragments of prayer. None of them yet know they are galloping toward eternity. Then the trumpet sounds. The lines begin to move, slowly at first, then faster, hooves striking the earth in perfect rhythm. The ground shakes beneath them. Dust rises, golden in the light. Ahead, the valley narrows, and the Russian guns begin to fire. The first volley tears through the ranks like an invisible scythe. Men and horses are ripped apart, bodies flung into the air. Still the formation holds. The brigade presses forward, swallowed by smoke and flame. Cannonballs howl past like freighted wind. Shrapnel hisses through the air. Riders fall, their cries drowned by the thunder of hooves. Yet still, they ride straight into the storm. To those watching from the hills, the sight is otherworldly. A river of red and gold surges down the valley, shimmering through the smoke, then vanishing in explosions of dust. It is both magnificent and unbearable, courage and catastrophe entwined. Raglan, watching from afar, lowers his spyglass. They have gone too far, he murmurs. But it is too late. In the valley, chaos reigns. Horses crash into one another, their riders slashing wildly with sabers. The Russian guns blaze at point-blank range, cutting lanes through the cavalry. Men tumble, trampled by their comrades. The smell of blood and powder fills the air. The survivors reach the battery, a handful of riders among the ruins, and hurl themselves at the gunners. For a moment, impossibly, they break through. Sabers clash against bayonets. The Russians reel in disbelief. But there is no one left to hold the ground. The brigade has no support, no orders beyond this madness. Within minutes, the survivors turn back, now riding through the same gauntlet of fire that had already claimed half their number. On the return, the slaughter deepens. The horses, wounded and panicked, stumble over corpses. Smoke blinds the men. The air is thick with screams. Captain Nolan, who had delivered the order, is among the first to die. Struck by a shell in mid-gallop, his body thrown high into the air. Lord Cardigan, ever the aristocrat, rides untouched through the storm, returning in icy composure as if on parade. Behind him, the valley is carpeted with the dead. When the survivors emerge from the smoke, the silence is unbearable. Out of 600, fewer than 200 remain unscathed. The rest are gone, some buried under fallen horses, others vanished into the dust. Those who return do so in disbelief, faces grey with shock. A sergeant stares at the torn remnants of his regiment and whispers, "It was not war, it was murder." On the hillside, Raglan demands to know what went wrong. Lucan blames Cardigan. Cardigan blames Nolan, and the truth dissolves into pride and self-preservation. No one will admit the order was misunderstood. No one will bear the guilt. The valley, still echoing with cannon fire, becomes a grave of reputation as well as of men. By dusk, the wind had died. The smoke drifts away, revealing what courage has cost. Scattered across the plain lie hundreds of bodies, British, Russian, and horse alike, indistinguishable in death. The valley glows faintly in the last light of the sun, as if the earth itself mourns. And yet, amid the ruin, a strange reverence takes hold. Even the enemy is said to have watched in awe, struck silent by the sheer unthinkable bravery of the charge. The next morning, the survivors gather, dazed at their picket lines. The names are read. The valley will forever bear the weight of their obedience and their folly. What began as a misheard order has become a legend written in blood. And from that moment, the British Empire will never again speak of war without remembering the Valley of Death, where courage defied reason, and honor was both triumph and tragedy. When the guns at Balaclava finally fall silent, the valley becomes a graveyard. The smoke lifts slowly, revealing the broken silhouettes of men and horses strewn across the plain. Sabers glint in the dirt beside shattered helmets. The cries of the wounded echo faintly between the hills, a hollow sound that fades into the wind. Out of 600 who rode, fewer than 200 returned without a wound or scar. The rest are scattered across the field, some dead, some dying, others staring blankly into the distance as if the world has stopped turning. For the survivors, there are no words left to describe what they have seen. In the British camp, the returning cavalry are greeted with silence. Even the buglers cannot bring themselves to sound a note. Men who once boasted of gallantry now walk as if half their souls remain in the valley. Their horses, blood-stained and trembling, are tended like comrades. The surgeons work into the night, hands slick with mud and blood, as the moans of the dying fill the tents. And amid the horror, one truth begins to settle among them. This was not a victory. It was obedience carried to the edge of annihilation. The reports travel swiftly. Correspondents in the field, among them the young and fearless William Howard Russell of the Times, pen dispatches that will shake Britain to its core. His words, written in disbelief and anger, describe not triumph but tragedy, the heroism of men betrayed by the arrogance of their commanders. Within weeks, his account is read across the empire, in London clubs, in Scottish drawing rooms, in the smoky taverns of Manchester. For the first time, the public sees war not through official bulletins, but through the eyes of those who bled for it. Shock turns to outrage. Parliament demands answers. How could such disciplined men be thrown into the teeth of Russian guns by an order so vague, so reckless? Ministers stammer, generals write memoranda heavy with excuses. Raglan blames his subordinates. Lucan and Cardigan blame each other. Each defends his honor, each denies his fault. Yet, outside Westminster, the nation's sympathy belongs not to the lords, but to the soldiers. The ordinary men who had no choice but to obey. Amid the grief and confusion, something extraordinary happens. The horror of the charge begins to transform, not vanish, but harden into legend. Newspapers print romantic sketches of the Light Brigade, riding through smoke and glory. The public, desperate to make sense of the loss, wraps tragedy in heroism. And then, from a quiet study in London, comes the voice that seals their immortality. Alfred, Lord Tennyson, poet laureate of Britain, reads Russell's report and is struck by its paradox. The madness and the magnificence of that doomed ride. In a burst of inspiration, he writes a poem that will become an anthem for courage itself. The charge of the Light Brigade appears in print before the year's end. Its verses roll across the empire like a sermon. Theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. The nation weeps and believes. The poem turns disaster into destiny, folly into faith. In Tennyson's lines, the soldiers become more than victims. They are martyrs to duty, men who embody the empire's highest virtue, obedience unto death. It is poetry that heals the wound, but it also conceals it. Behind the rhythm of the words lies a silence no verse can fill, the silence of those who knew the truth. For the men who survived, the glory feels hollow. Let his home speak not of triumph, but of loss. One trooper writes that he dreams each night of the valley, of faces he cannot forget. Another confides that the sound of cannon now makes him tremble. They return to a homeland that calls them heroes, yet cannot comprehend their suffering. Some will never ride again. Others will vanish into poverty, their medals their only proof that the world once called them brave. Meanwhile, in the corridors of power, lessons are whispered, but not yet learned. The machinery of the empire grinds on, driven by pride and inertia. Yet something subtle has shifted in the British mind. The myth of perfect command, of infallible aristocratic leadership, has cracked. The war that began in confidence now carries a shadow of doubt. Florence Nightingale's reports from the hospitals of Scutari expose the same negligence that doomed the Light Brigade. Reformers begin to speak of a new kind of Britain, one that must modernize or perish. But in the autumn after Balaclava, that reckoning is still to come. For now, Britain clings to the comfort of poetry and pride. Paintings of the charge hang in drawing rooms. Medals are struck. Memorials are planned. Mothers console themselves with the thought that their sons died for England. The empire, as always, turns tragedy into meaning. And yet, beneath the ceremony, an unease persists. A quiet awareness that courage alone cannot justify catastrophe. The Valley of Death has revealed a deeper truth about the empire's soul. That its glory is inseparable from its guilt. The Light Brigade may have ridden into legend, but their sacrifice leaves a question that no poem can answer. What is bravery if it serves confusion? What is loyalty if it demands the lives of the innocent? These are the questions Britain will carry long after the guns fall silent. Questions that will echo through every reform, every campaign, every memory of the empire that dared to call its disasters divine. The winter after Balaclava settles like a curse over the Crimean Peninsula. The wind from the Black Sea cuts through canvas and bone alike. In the British camps before Sevastopol, men die not from bullets, but from cold and neglect. Tents collapse under sleet. Uniforms rot into rags. A soldier's diary notes, "We are dying for want of what the generals will not see." The Crimean War, born of pride and confusion, has become an ordeal of endurance. And for the first time, the British Empire begins to question not its enemies, but itself. The reports from the front grow darker by the week. Food spoils in warehouses miles from the starving troops. Medical stores lie forgotten in the holds of ships. Horses are slaughtered for lack of forage, their bones scattered across the frozen fields. Disease spreads like wildfire. Cholera, dysentery, frostbite, each claiming more lives than the enemy's guns. Officers still dine by candlelight, their mess tents lined with silver. But outside, soldiers dig trenches through frozen mud with bare hands. The old habits of empire, hierarchy, complacency, and blind obedience are consuming their own sons. In London, the newspapers ignited a storm. William Howard Russell's dispatches from the Crimea and the letters of soldiers' families tear through the veil of official optimism. The British public, for the first time in its modern history, sees the human cost of war in print, not as glory, but as neglect. The myth of the empire's perfection begins to crack. "Our army," one editorial declares, "has been defeated not by the Russians, but by its own mismanagement." Out of this revelation emerges a figure who will change Britain's conscience: Florence Nightingale. A woman of intellect and resolve, she arrives in the hospital at Scutari and finds scenes beyond imagination. Corridors slick with blood, wards crawling with vermin, men lying in their own filth, forgotten by the system that sent them to fight. Nightingale, with her small team of nurses, begins a revolution not with muskets, but with soap, order, and compassion. She demands a sanitation, accountability, and light. At night, she walks the rows of cots by lamplight, her shadow long against the walls. To the soldiers, she becomes the lady with the lamp, a symbol that the empire, for all its pride, still possesses a heart capable of mercy. Her work is not simply charity. It is a rebellion cloaked in service. Nightingale writes reports so damning that even Parliament cannot ignore them. Statistics, drawn in her own careful hand, show that disease kills 7 times more soldiers than battle. Her data and her defiance spark public outrage. When she returns to England, she is greeted not as a saint, but as a reformer, one who will shame the powerful into change. Back in the Crimea, the army staggers on. The siege of Sevastopol drags through the winter, its trenches filled with snow and silence. Letters from home speak of reform committees and inquiries, but for the soldiers, little changes. They fight not for glory now, but for survival. When the fortress finally falls, it brings no celebration, only exhaustion. Britain has technically won, but at a cost that defies reason. 20,000 lives, most lost to incompetence rather than combat. In the months that follow, inquiry turns to introspection. The House of Commons convenes the McNeill-Tulloch Commission to investigate the failures of supply and command. Its findings are brutal, condemning a military system that values rank over reason, tradition over truth. Lord Raglan dies before the report is finished, a man broken by duty and denial. His death, like the charge he ordered, becomes a symbol of an age out of time with itself. Yet amid the wreckage, something new takes root. Reformers demand a professional army, built not on aristocratic privilege, but on merit and efficiency. The Army Medical Department is restructured. Supply chains are modernized. Officers are trained in science and logistics rather than ceremony. The Empire begins, reluctantly, to learn from its own humiliation. The Light Brigade's loss, once a story of glory, now becomes a mirror, reflecting the contradictions of a nation both mighty and flawed. In Britain's drawing rooms, Tennyson's poem is still recited, but now its meaning shifts. The lines that once exalted obedience begin to sound like lamentation. Theirs not to reason why. No longer feels noble, it feels tragic. The public starts to ask the question the soldiers never could. Should they have reasoned why? And if not them, then who must? As the decade turns, a modern Britain begins to stir. Industrial, restless, aware of its own conscience. The war that began in arrogance ends in awakening. The Light Brigade's ride into the Valley of Death has forced the Empire to confront the limits of its grandeur. Out of its folly, a new kind of greatness emerges, not measured in conquest, but in reform. The Crimean War will be remembered not for the ground it gained, but for the ground it forced Britain to see beneath its own feet. In its cold valleys and blood-soaked hospitals, the Empire looked into its reflection and found both shame and strength. And though it would take years to heal, this reckoning marked the beginning of a new truth. That courage without wisdom is not glory, but grief. When the guns of Sevastopol finally fall silent, Britain's soldiers return home to a nation changed by grief and revelation. The Crimean War has ended, not with a roar of triumph, but with a long, uneasy silence. The empire that once seemed invincible now looks inward, sobered by the realization that bravery alone cannot mend what arrogance has broken. Yet in that reckoning lies the beginning of transformation. For though the charge of the Light Brigade was a military failure, it became something larger, a moral turning point, a myth through which Britain redefined itself. The first to arrive home are the survivors of Balaclava, thin, limping men who carry more ghosts than medals. They are greeted by crowds that cheer and weep in equal measure. Newspapers hail them as heroes who rode into the mouth of hell. Portraits are painted, honors bestowed. But beneath the pageantry, something deeper stirs. The public no longer sees its soldiers as distant instruments of empire. They see them as sons and brothers, ordinary men bound by duty. The Light Brigade's courage has exposed a truth that empire had long concealed, that its strength rests not in aristocrats or admirals, but in the endurance of common men. This realization spreads like quiet fire through the British mind. For centuries, the army had been a mirror of class, officers born to command, soldiers born to obey. But Balaclava shattered that illusion. No lineage, no title, no privilege could stand untouched by that valley of fire. When the cannons opened, courage was the only currency that mattered. And when the survivors returned, they brought with them the unspoken demand that leadership itself must change. In Parliament, reform follows reflection. Committees debate the failures of the war, while reformers seize the moment to reshape the army into something more modern, more humane. Commissions are founded, training standardized, promotions slowly tied to merit rather than birth. What had once been the preserve of the few begins, tentatively, to open to the capable. The empire's military heart, long corroded by tradition, begins to beat again with a pulse of realism and reform. Yet the transformation is not only institutional, it is spiritual. In churches and schools, in art and verse, the charge becomes Britain's parable of endurance. It tells of men who obeyed even when reason failed, who faced annihilation without hatred, who rode not for conquest, but for comradeship. It is a story of obedience to duty, even in the shadow of folly. And in that paradox, the Victorians find their moral compass. The empire, for all its contradictions, begins to see itself as a guardian, not just of power, but of principle. Florence Nightingale's legacy spreads alongside that of the Light Brigade. Her reforms of medicine and sanitation give Britain a new vocabulary of compassion and competence. The war that began in confusion ends by inspiring professionalism. In hospitals, in barracks, in government. The empire, wounded and wiser, learns that its survival depends as much on reflection as on might. By the time the veterans of the Crimea grow old, the valley of Balaclava has become sacred ground. Pilgrims and poets alike speak of it as if it were a shrine, not to victory, but to valor without reward. Children recite Tennyson's verses in schoolrooms. Soldiers quote them on parade. When can their glory fade? He asked, and the answer, it seems, is never. For the charge endures not as an act of triumph, but as a meditation on what it means to be British. To stand one's ground, even when reason falters. To believe that courage itself can redeem mistakes, but history is never still. The decades that follow will test this new moral empire again and again, in India, in Africa, across continents and centuries. And yet, in every trial, the memory of the Light Brigade lingers, shaping the nation's conscience. It reminds Britain that power without humility is perilous, that obedience without reflection leads to ruin, and that true strength lies not in domination, but in the capacity to learn from failure. In the quiet of his final years, Tennyson reflected that his poem had captured not the glory of war, but the sorrow of it. He had written of men who made the noblest mistake in military history, and in doing so, he gave Britain a language to mourn without despair. For from that valley, that place of smoke and thunder, emerged not only loss, but redemption. The Light Brigade did not save an empire through conquest. They saved it through conscience. Their sacrifice pierced the armor of complacency and forced a mighty nation to see itself as mortal, capable of error, yet also of grace. From their failure rose a stronger ideal, that duty, however misled, can still ennoble, that courage, even in catastrophe, can still be redeemed. And so, the charge that began as tragedy ends as testament. The empire would never again ride so blindly into fire, nor would it ever forget those who did. For in their obedience, Britain found reflection. In their ruin, it found renewal. And in their courage, fierce, futile, and eternal, it found the saving of its own soul. And if you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful and emotional stories from Britain's past. These aren't just tales of war and empire. They're reflections of courage, sacrifice, and the timeless human spirit. Subscribe now to keep history alive.